So finally, I am delighted to be able to hand over to Grant Munro, who I don't need to introduce, but he is our Terrestrial team leader, and we're delighted that he's going to talk about the work, land management that's been worked on by Andy Stanworth, Dave Higgins, Ben Taylor, and we'll really look forward to hearing more about that. So over to you, Grant, and just to say big thanks to everyone for everything that has brought all this work that we're able to do together in very many different ways. Thank you all. Over to you, Grant. Thank you.
That was a bit quick. I'm not sure I'm ready.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. The basis of this is that conservation in the past has quite often been limited to specific sites or single species. And with new issues such as climate change, which expands across the landscape scale, we really have to look at trying to extend conservation out of these small enclaves out into the general landscape. And that's into the general working landscape. So how can we incorporate conservation into the working landscape of the Falklands? Now, to look at a few figures, you can see the balance. At the moment, it's only about 2.9% of the Falkland Islands is under some form of conservation management. Now, the definition of that's a little bit grey, that bit you can take a bit away. But if you say about 2.9 to 92, which is a kind of a nice balanced figure. So, and that's at the general level. So even if you look at the specific important sites, so if you take the important plant areas, which you'd think, well, they're the important sites, they should have a higher level of protection or management, it's actually the same. So it's still only about 2.6% of the land area of the important plant areas are under effective management. The landscape, and I feel a bit awkward saying this, I'm talking about drying landscapes on a day where it's been torrential rain all day long. But the landscape is becoming increasingly susceptible to erosion. And if you look at a few metrics of soils and vegetation and slope and such like, it's estimated about 94% of the softened soils are actually susceptible at medium or high levels of soil erosion. We already have, and again an estimated figure, about 5,000 hectares of bare black peat. Efforts over the last 20 years, we've planted about 70 hectares. So if you multiply that up, it's going to take us 1,500 years to replant what we already have eroded. Now in relative terms, that's when we started planting tussock when the Romans left Albion, wasn't even called Britain at that point. And there were a few Vikings running around raping and pillaging the Anglo-Saxons. If we started then, we would still be planting tussock now. So to demonstrate that, these slides were going to be later in the demonstration, but I thought it kind of brings home the message and you can maybe bear it in mind as we go through. So this is Middle Island, it's one of Falkland Conservation Islands, and all the shaded areas are the areas that we have planted with tussock to date over the last 3 years. We run a volunteer program, and Georgia Seafoods works with us to do it. Now, I left that shading in because it kind of creates a boundary that you can then compare to. So the kind of areas in the next few slides to look at is, this is a clay patch area, still hasn't completely formed yet. This is in 2004. And then if you look at the boundaries here, so if you look at this area, and then out round here in the subsequent photographs, you'll see quite how much it's extended. So that's 2011, and you can see out to the right there, that big black area is forming. This is formed. The clay patch, the clay is now showing through, and the boundaries have extended. So you can see what's happened here is that the peat has blown off what is now clay patch. It gets blown into the inland vegetation. The inland vegetation is then swamped, which smothers and kills that vegetation, which then destabilizes that soil because it's no longer vegetation holding it together, and the whole erosion process moves in. If we go forward even more recently, 2023, you can see how it's just another step. If we go back to the very first year. If we'd done the planting we'd done in that first year, we'd have pretty much solved the problem. It's all covered. You know, if we jump back there, and our planting rate's barely keeping up with the rate of erosion. So that's what we're working with. If you look at New Island, this is a computer-generated model from using satellite imagery. Over the last 20 years, we've lost about 9 football fields of soil every year, year on year, and that's just marching forwards. These are islands, but that's no different from any other, farms and places around the Falklands which are suffering from erosion. Now the opportunities are, we're working to the same message as farmers, and the farmers are really concerned about this as well. Obviously, they're seeing their pastures disappear. The native pasture is what really supports all our biodiversity on land, and it is that same native pasture that generates their production. Each kilogram of wool is 95% protein. That's coming from a native pasture. And it's really like a solar panel. People at camp would be aware that the leaves of the plant are like your solar panel, and then your tussock bog and the roots is like your battery. If you take away the solar panel, or if you run down the battery too far and too often, then your battery dies. So Falklands Conservation are working within it. We have a few themes within the organisation. We have the space for nature, we have using nature, and we have restoring nature. And that landscape scale conservation, working with the farmers, fits in to all these themes. So what are we really working with? I'm going to call them bunch grasses, because here we have a bit of a confusion. If I call them tussock, you won't know if I'm talking about tussock or tussac. So going right back to the sort of basics of plant science, I guess, and where it overlaps with farmers. So the shape of the plant in itself is like a big funnel. It's catching the rain and it funnels it into the roots. The roots then are the access into the soil that allows the filtration, and it's where it's most needed. The outer leaves die back, and they're creating a little capsule of dead, canned, still air in the plant, which then reduces how much plant the moisture is losing. And the most important bit is probably, you'll see it on this picture here, this dead skirt of leaf then dies down and creates this little vegetation. This is bluegrass, by the way, and that's tussock. That creates an absorbent mat. So if you can imagine having a spill in your kitchen, you've got a tile floor, you accidentally spill your jug, it splatters everywhere and it runs off. If you've got a blanket or a rug or something like that on the floor, then you spill it and it just seeps in and stays there. And that's what that leaf litter is doing. It's also what's generating the peat in the soil underneath. Obviously you've got the absorbent mat on the top, it gradually breaks down, and at the bottom it's turning into peat. So it's very important to keep that litter. Now, as I say, there is overlap. This is what the farmers are grazing. It's not complete overlap. If you were theoretically looking at your maximum agricultural production, you're looking at grazing it at the level that you're taking all that annual excess production off, and that's going into your sheep and going into your wool. Obviously, if you're doing that, you are reducing that area of leaf which is going to die back into senesce and create that mat. So you are kind of blocking the process slightly, and that mat is no longer forming at the same rate, and therefore the rate it's decomposing at the bottom is getting ahead of the rate it's being added to at the top, and then you gradually lose it. So there is this just gradual breakdown. And the challenge is meeting somewhere in the middle, where you're getting the best of both worlds. And this was, just because plants amaze me, I can't really call this landscape scale whilst we're getting into microscopes, but the plants in the previous slide are actually modifying their own environment. They're creating shelter for themselves, they're insulating the soil, they're moderating the temperature. The plant is doing that itself at the level of individual leaf and its individual cell. Obviously, to photosynthesize, it has to exchange gas. But just like you on a cold day, each time you exhale and exhale, you're losing moisture in your breath. You can see it. The plant's doing exactly the same, and it has to control that. Now, there's a way it can do it. You can have waxy cuticles, you can have hairs on your leaf, you can have pits, you can curve leaves, or in some of your hardest grasses, you can have all of it. So this is the outside of the leaf. The whole leaf is curled in itself. The outside is all waxy cuticles, so it can't lose anything from the outside. Inside, you've then got hairs, which is creating more little pockets of air, and the stomata, which are these cells here, which basically allow the gas in, are tucked right down here in the most protected positions. When that plant becomes moisture stressed, these close. The moment these close, your plant stops growing. It can't make gas anymore, it can't photosynthesize anymore, and it's stopped. So if it's already dry conditions and it's a sunny day, well, by mid-morning, your plant will have, just closed up its stomata, and it will no longer be growing. That's not good for conservation, it's not good for agriculture, it's not good for the farm. And I just like it because it's smiley faces. So each time you're going to, when you leave the Chamber of Commerce here and want to walk across the grass, just remember you are walking on smiley faces. So what does all that mean? Well, it means under good, healthy, native pasture, we've got higher moisture content, we've got more of the lower bulk density, so it's more like a sponge. It can absorb the soil and greater organic matter. What does that mean in practical terms? Well, we've got a less stressed plant, so it's a longer growing season. We've got greater soil development, more peak depth, and overall greater productivity. If you look at these graphs quickly here, I won't go into the details of it, but they're both fence line effects. So that was going from your high stocking rate across the fence line into kind of native pasture, and that's the level of water. So you can see how the soil water, the native pasture is retaining that moisture and keeping the vegetation wet. This was on an offshore tussock island that has been grazed. It's got a fence line halfway across. So one side is now Yorkshire fog, the other side is still the original tussock. And the tussock is, the soil's 2.5 times deeper, 4 times wetter. So really the next question is, how can we identify these good habitats? How can a farmer on their farm see where their best areas are? And Dave's Peat project has worked on this over the last couple of years, and we have, it's quite hard, subjectively you can tell, and people will assess whether that's good, that's bad. It's very hard to put up a value on that. So this was a simple way where you can monitor habitats, you can objectively and quantifiably put a value on it, and then you can also use that value, more importantly, for monitoring it. So you can identify where your good sites are, you can then look at that in future years and see if that is improving in quality or decreasing in quality, and then modify your land management practices or stocking rates or whatever accordingly. And it's very, very simple. This is the first draft. This isn't the final copy. There's a little bit of tinkering around the edges to do. But you walk along the transect, you count the birds, and then on the way back, you will score various features positively or negatively. So you'll get plus points for good things, minus points for bad things. You have a sheet, and at the end, you tally all your pluses and all your minuses up, and you get a score. So, your normal kind of run-of-the-mill habitats, you're probably going to be in about moderate. If you go to really good offshore islands, which are pristine, you're going to be very good. And if you're in a great big eroded patch, you're very poor. These descriptors don't really matter. It's just a number. It doesn't mean anything per se, but it allows you to see it move. And most importantly, it's reportable. You can file that away. You've got a number. And if you're in, well, we'll come on to it later. If you're in the responsible wool standard, then that generates documentation which you can show to the scheme manager of how your biodiversity is doing. Responsible wool standard is an initiative. It's a global initiative. It is a branding of your wool to show it's coming from a responsible source. It covers areas. It's not just environmental. It covers areas from your sheep animal husbandry to your workers' social welfare and also factors of the environment. Within that, the farmers are meant to have a biodiversity management plan. They're also meant to monitor the biodiversity. And we as an organisation are very aware, it's like if I had to go out and condition store a ram or look at a micro, and I wouldn't really know how to do that. This isn't necessarily a skill they would have. So it's how can we help them to progress and move forward with the responsible wool standard, which we would like to see, because it also has environmental benefits. And it goes back to that balance between the 2.9% in conservation and 92% in agriculture. If we can even get, say, a 5 or a 10% improvement in the agricultural land and the conservation of that, well, if you multiply that up over 1 million hectares, that is actually a far better net gain for conservation than having one small reserve of 1,000 hectares where you've got 100% benefit. So it's small gains, but across a vast area. So we are working with the Department of Agriculture over this, and Erica specifically. She has similar monitoring protocols for the pasture, so we've meshed into that so you can monitor both your pasture and your habitats at the same time. We'll be running a number of courses out in camp through the summer, busy period, but we'll try and fit in between shearing, and hopefully provide the tools that we can start monitoring and managing, not just for your farm production, but also for your biodiversity. Another option which could potentially give economic diversification, Ben is working on. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail on it. It's essentially, is the carbon in the soil, does it have a value? Historically, we've taken peat cores. They go down 10,000 years in the deepest ones, and we know that historically we have accumulated carbon. But that is an average over 10,000 years. It could have gone up to a peak, and we could have now been able to talk in declining. So are we actually still sequestrating carbon? That's the first question that has to be answered. So that's the science. So we'll have flux towers and gas exchange cabinets around the island, and that will provide a scientific answer. Are we still sequestrating carbon, and at what rate? We'll also try and answer some of the practical questions. How would you value these carbon units? How would you manage a scheme? Is the UK peatland code applicable to the Falklands, or does it need some adjustments? So it'll tackle it both from the science side and the practical side. If we're not actually accumulating carbon, well, that kind of option slightly gets shunted out of the picture. Is it still worthwhile to set aside land? I would say definitely yes. In other jurisdictions, agricultural agri-environment schemes are quite common. If you look at the UK, then to try and encourage reforestation, there was grant and assistance for planting, for hedgerow reinstatement, for farmland burns. And generally it will be a compensatory payment to the farmer for setting aside some of their productive land to go into that conservation usage, or whatever target the government is trying to encourage through this incentivization. If a small area of land is set aside and the farmer is guaranteed that for, say, 10 years of that scheme, then they will not be getting any more money than they would from the wool, but it would be a guaranteed income source. So as regards financial planning, then having the proportion of your income guaranteed, whereas wool prices might be going up or down and you might not be able to sell your clip, then that may be of some interest to some. These are a range of solutions. There is no one solution which is the magic bullet that solves it, but if there are a range of options and solutions, then hopefully people can select which of them is most appropriate for them and for their farm. Now, to do this, there are obviously two big questions that we ask and we are working on. The one is, at what rate would you pay them? You need an objective financial valuation of the lands, which is fair for the farmer, sufficiently attractive that it encourages them into the scheme, but from a government perspective it needs to be sustainable and affordable, and from a societal perspective, you know, the other taxpayers have to believe it's a worthwhile cause. So there's a balance to be found. And set aside, it's catching before it's too late. You can see the picture that once that tussock's on, once the soil is destabilised, it's kind of off. If you can actually take the land, which is maybe struggling a bit, and set it aside and rest it, then I'm sure there should be a picture on that far side. But it's not showing. There we go. Is that one? Is that next slide? No, sorry, okay. Get on stuff. I don't know what's happened here. Not to worry. But yes, obviously, they have to be able to afford it. You know, I have spoken with some, and they are interested, but if they have to take off a whole paddock and they lose 600 or 700 wethers out of an already small farm, then that whole financial viability of the farm is in the balance. So, yeah, we have to ask how much we as a society are prepared to pay for that. It's not going to come free, whereas carbon credits is money coming in from outside, and everyone will be fine with that. If that's not possible, what assistance and at what level can we give to farmers? I mean, globally, the target is 30 by 30 is the catchphrase, which is meant to be 30% of the land area in some form of conservation management by 2030. So how much would it take to do that in the Falklands? 700,000, a million per annum? We don't have final figures yet, that whole debate's got to come. But to initiate it, we as an organisation and others are sort of trying to find out what that would be, and then we can go to the relevant decision makers and see if we can get the buy-in. That was actually from a farm that some would recognise, but this is the difference it can make. This was the coastal slopes and cliffs around Penguin Point on Dunbar Farm, which they decided themselves to set aside and take the stocking off, and about 10 years later, this is the result. So we've got some non-natives, an amazing amount of tussock and boxwood reseeding itself in. There's a few more pictures coming up. So, you know, that's the difference that it can make. So it's how can you extend that and get more of that in. So I mean, set aside ideally is best if you catch it early, and then you can have that, what I would call passive restoration. It's just let nature fix itself. When it's gone too far, then we have to intervene, and you can see the pictures there on Middle Island. To do that, though, we really need to scale up. As I say, going back to what I described at the beginning, you know, it's going to take us at current rate 1,500 years to plant what we've already got, and it's being formed faster than we're managing to plant it. So how can we actually scale up the enterprise that is going to make a significant difference? So, you know, it has to be based off a financial model. Nurseries, if they're going to produce 5,000 boxwood seedlings a year, they need to know they're going to be able to sell these 5,000 boxwood and to make that forward investment in raising the stock. Planted, it should be a recognised job or career option. We have seasonal contract gangs for other tasks in the Falklands, like shearing, like fencing, and you know, can planting be recognised as that? And it fits into set aside. Obviously, that area that you're restoring has to be set aside. You can't restore it with stock still on it, because they'll go in and eat all your new seedlings and new planted plants before it's had a chance to re-establish. So that can be value added. And there are a lot of grant type organisations and others which they're not going to pay for the set aside. That's a a scheme which is just too big at a national level, but the value added of that set aside. So if you set aside it, then you can go in and plant, and they would provide funding for that. So it's trying to mix and match your funding sources for the greater good. And there's some pictures from Sally. I'm just saying, you know, with the effort, it is possible. That's the amazing work they've been doing on Hummock Island. But it's, you know, it is an effort. So, you know, I won't go through everyone because I guarantee forget, but, you know, there are people already starting to do this on their own behalf by themselves. There are others involved, which we are getting funding from various sources to do that. But nationally, we're still going backwards, so we really must scale it up to the next level. And we have to put a value on that. You know, it's our rural heritage, you know, it's the economic diversification of camp. There's so many factors involved. So I thought I'd just end up with some better news. One initiative that is happening at the landscape scale is the Hill Cove National Park. I'm not wanting to preempt this. It is going to public consultation by FIG early next year, but it was really just to give a taster for it. It's 12,000 hectares, and that's 1% of our land area, so that's an immediate boost at that landscape scale. So we have been involved in it. We went out last summer. It is an important plant area, and we went out and resurveyed that. Rebecca initially, years ago at Conservation, did the original surveys, and Tim Carr, one of our trustees in the UK, also went out subsequently and then surveyed Falklands and Salvia. So we were going out to revisit these sites, reassess the populations, and health. So Andy and myself hiked around rather briskly for 5 or 6 days and ended up with about 774 plant records, which increased the totals here. So, you know, botanically it's an amazing place. Over half of the Falkland Island plant species are all represented in the Hill Cove Mountains. 64% of our endemic plants are in there. 43% of the endangered plants in the Falklands, so, and 13 broad habitat types. So it is an amazing spot. Hard to tie it down to favourite places. I think the 3 highlights for me was the Falklands and the Salvia. It looks like a very miniature baby snake plant for those that haven't seen it, because it does only grow at the very top of the mountains on these montane gravel clay patches. So there's 3 sites in Hill Cove Mountains and 2 sites in the Hornby Mountains across from the Port Howard Mountains. So incredibly rare, right at the top of the mountains. So again, with climate change, incredibly vulnerable. It's got nowhere to go. Normally a high altitude plant, as climate change and it warms, would move up the contours, so it would move higher to maintain that cooler temperature. They're already at the top of the mountains on an island, so they can't go up in altitude. They can't go down in latitude, they're stuck there. So incredibly important for conservation. The Hole, which is a place in Mount Robinson with a beautiful little brook that runs down and around nooks and crannies, and just ferns everywhere. So lots of our rare ferns there. And after a long hot day, it was beautiful just to stick your feet in the stream and go, ah. And then the scarp slopes around Mount Adam. So that's the top of Mount Adam there. That's not the mountain top tarn. The mountain top tarn's up in there. But a fantastic range of plants. And then once you start getting up into the little gullies running up through the rocks here, then again, fantastic range of plants. And just on scenery value as well. It's a fantastic and wonderful place. So I would encourage you all, when the public consultation comes out, to read it and have your say, and hopefully we can have the Falkland Islands first national park. So thank you very much, and hope you find something of interest. Are you allowed to ask a question?
Of course I am. No, can you show again the progress of Middle Island?
to. In fact, yes, for all the volunteers that have taken place, the satellite imagery for Middle Island has just been updated. So, in fact, if you zoom in now, you will see each single individual tussock tiller that's been planted. And the resolution is just incredible. You can zoom right in, and every tiller that has been planted is visible there. So, if you knew which baby tiller you planted, you can track the progress of your tiller. And if there's a big bare black patch, well, won't say any more. So yeah, this is the progress here. So if you go 2004, and as I say, if you kind of look, obviously that's a clay patch. You'll see it appearing. You'll see a big bit extending here, extending out here, and then this whole area will eventually turn. Oops, a bit quick. So that's. It was really between about 2006 and 2011 it started moving. We had originally kind of followed up what you might call benevolent neglect. We had kind of assumed if you take the stalk off, it will regenerate itself naturally. But going back to how I described that the plants modify their own environment, they create their own shelter, their own moisture. Well, once these remnant bogs get too separated, that dead skirt dies down but then gets blown away. Plants aren't close enough to create that mutual shelter. So whilst the remnant bogs don't die immediately, they just don't regenerate, and eventually as they get older and older, they just kind of degenerate. And yeah, obviously once that peat starts eroding and it gets down to the basal, you know, if you've seen our, see on the next slide, you know, you'll see the graduation of here, but it's much more fibrous open peat, and then it gets down to very dark black peat. Once that dries out, that becomes hydrophobic, so it's essentially turned into concrete. However much you wet it, it's not going to re-wet. So once that erosion is blowing all the nice fibrous stuff where you get down to that dense black stuff, that blows away, and it's just like having hydrophobic gravel being deposited over the inland vegetation. Yeah, that's two extremes. It's rather scary, but I prefer the good news at the end. I was going to say, it's probably not your typical AGM speech. Esther makes everything warm and fuzzy, and you feel good about it. I'm the half-empty glass person, so yeah. Any other questions?
So what's your success rate on the planting?
It is, yeah, I mean, obviously it depends what you're planting into. When we planted right on the edge, the first year success is always very good, and then there's a kind of a split between the really dark basal peat, so right on the edge of the clay patch where it's very thin and it's just hard and black. Then in subsequent years you will get thinning out. On the inland stuff, I mean, we're up at 80% plus success on the tillers. Again, we probably, see Sally's at the back there, we've had a tendency to kind of decrease our plant spacing over the years. So it's a quadratic function. If you half your planting spacing, you quadruple the number of plants you need. So we always have that balance between, well, we want them close enough that they're giving some shelter, but we don't want them too close because then it'll take 4 times more effort to actually plant the same area. So we'll space it out. So we had to start off with about 1.5 meters spacing. That's probably decreased to about 1 meter spacing. It's getting them closer together, so they're getting that mutual shelter earlier. It does seem quite important. If you're planting at the wider spacing and then one dies, and suddenly you've got 3 meter spacing. But yeah, we've had about 80% success.
Are you affected by rust?
Haven't been so far, no. I mean, that's not to say it can't be. I mean, it can come in future years, but it's really just you know, you can see from these pictures, if we don't make an effort, we're going to lose an island. So it's really just to plug along. And we have now started with these first year's plantings. The last couple of days of the last year of yours, we did some beating up. So we were going back through and replacing the ones that have died to again decrease these plant spacing. I mean, if people are interested, I can maybe give a talk later in the year as well. We've got some better pictures of it. I didn't want to get too bogged down. I thought it was quite a large subject to cover, so I would do everything at a very superficial level. But if anyone wanted any presentation about specifics or just one aspect of the talk, then I'm more than happy to do that.
You said 80% success.
Success. So that's the rate of mortality. Not rate of mortality, the rate of living. When I counted in the first year, I haven't done it recently, to be honest. So going down 2 years, I don't actually know the figures. I mean, I can go back and check that. We have got plots, so we do a radial count and string that, put in a post, have a string, walk in a circle, how many plants in a circle. So we can do subsampling with that. When I did the first counts, then within my counts for the tussock grass was range between about 75 and 97% was the range
Within a year.
within the year. Yeah. The bluegrass and the flaming hooch and others we haven't had so much success with. The tussock does seem to be the best. Boxwood does well. The other two haven't done as well. So
You've planted the boxwood?
we have planted boxwood as well along this along this sort of seaward strip of the clay patch. It's one of the few that essentially will grow into the clay and into the mineral. Obviously, once you've lost all your peat and you're down to the clay patch, that's pretty much game over. In that the clay here has got a very high aluminium content, so it's actually got an aluminium toxicity to plants. So really it's a very, very slow encroachment from the side of the clay patch. In future years, it's very difficult for plants to break into it. There are a few, and we will start some trials, but to my thinking, when you've already got 5,000 hectares of black peat, that you should pick that as a low fruit. You know, clay patches are going to be so much more labour intensive and even more costly to try and do. That at least if you can buffer them like we have tried here, so it doesn't come any further inland, then as regards value for equity, it's probably better. But that's hard to say because obviously on an individual island owner's basis, I would love to see that clay patch reclaimed, but at a national level, and I think that black peat is obviously it's the easier low fruit as regards restoration.
Can I ask a question about your land valuation? Well,
Yeah.
I'm interested to know how you're going to tackle that, given it's quite a tricky area.
It is a tricky area, and we have to have a lot of discussions yet. We will be going forward having discussions with various people. We have, just as a first step, and I can't really kind of go into it because it's I guess it is a very sensitive subject, so I'm not sure we're quite ready to go out to a public meeting about it. But I did go back through the land register archives for the last 20 years and took land values for everything that had been sold in camp of the agricultural nature. So whole farms or farms that have been subdivided and sold as land only. I didn't count lifestyle blocks, so basically if you're just getting a house in a little paddock or a 50-acre plot on the road, they would discount it up from farm sales, complete farm sales, or partial farm sales over the last 20 years, and then work that out to per hectare value, and then compare that to alternative Falkland Island capital. I mean, basically a return on the capital. So if you had taken that same money and rather than buying land with it, put it into something else, what rate of return would you expect from that? Again, to try and avoid that sort of societal backlash where you might have people in town saying, well, I put my money there, I'm not getting that from my pension scheme, rental accommodation, pick your investment, so that then would pay you a comparable rate of return on that average value of the land. And it's not actually as bad as you think. I mean, most people say, oh, well, there's just extreme values here, there, and everywhere else. And there are extreme values, but they are outliers, and you can still, if you use your median value, you know, your box plots are still fairly reasonable. So, you know, it's a starting point. I'm not saying that will be the final value or whatever, but I think you just need some form of objective value to start a discussion from. But it will probably come into the department near you sometimes too.
I have a question for Andrea, actually. I mean, having listened to the talk on the value of keep the land going, us going, doing what we can to protect it. How do you see that working in with the way that the government policies, the current ones, are in terms of looking after the land? How can we make those two meet? Because there's an obvious divide at the moment.
Well, I didn't know anything about this, so there's a good point. I had to come here as a member to find out about it. But yes, obviously the stock take that we did in 2020 on the back of COVID set out that the government and it went to Executive Council and MLAs wanted us to look at the rural economy, so it was coming at it from a slightly different angle, but with the same potential solution. You know, about trying to ensure that people who live in the rural sector have enough income, you know, just to live at a good standard, reasonable standard, given the challenges around living off industries that are highly volatile for various different reasons. And within that, at that time, hadn't got as far as talking about set-asides and land easements, but of course people were already talking about carbon. I think it was in the list of potential areas to look at. So obviously through the Environment Department, that work's going on jointly with FC and SARI, with the carbon flux towers. There's various other strands of work. But in terms of a sort of a single project on land easements, I don't see it sitting like that. I see it as part of a suite of tools, because our role is more the rural economy, which is broader than that. But the way I had seen it going was that you would do a lot of background work first to understand what's out there. You wouldn't just back the first horse in town. You'd go out and see what are all the different potential methods that different jurisdictions have used with to get different outcomes and to see how they might work, and the pros and cons. There are all sorts of issues in there, legal issues around land covenants and things like that that roll over into the future. Land easements, are they short-term, medium-term, long-term? You know, what can you and can't you do on them? So there's all sorts of questions. So that's the kind of angle we're coming from. Land values is a really interesting one, because everybody has a very different view of how you set a land value. And I think probably a bit like if you put 20 lawyers in the room, you get 20 answers. Potentially, if you put 20 landowners in the room, you might get 20 different answers, because different people have different things that they think should be included. There'll be some core things, you know, land and area of land and assets on it, but you know, there's an awful lot more to it than that, I think.
It is a big question. And my personal feeling is everyone really kind of needs to get into the same room, because
I agree.
And meet in the middle, because it goes back to this, you know, as a landowner, you're going to want to tend to overvalue your land. I mean, it's human nature. But you have to realise that, you know, it has to be a fair price to the farmer, but, you know, it has to be sustainable to the government. The taxpayer's paying for it.
Why is it just the government?
So, well, whoever's funding it. I mean, it has to be sustainable funding.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you know, everyone has got to probably moderate their expectations, and the answer is somewhere in the middle. How quickly you can have these things is another.
But to finish what the point we made, Sally, once we've done that piece of work, which has already started, the idea was we would build sort of a framework and then come out to talk to all the relevant stakeholder organisations such as CSIL, but also landowners and other interests. Because it's not just, we don't consider this just a farming issue, we consider this bigger than farming.
That's really useful, and I think it's, it's going to be a useful.
I'm here as a member of FC, by the way.
Yes. Yes. You're
I
here
didn't
as a
really mean
member
to go
of
into
it.
much detail or that. It was just basically to try and get a
I'm here
picture
to
of
defend the government.
what we're actually doing, and there are some real tangibles there. There's other stuff that we're kind of working behind the scenes, and other stuff we're starting on. So we have done quite a lot of background work on the set side that hasn't really been launched.
Yes.
Probably good to share what we have done before that happens.
Yeah. No. Really
Because
useful.
we already have a kind of a list of schemes as well
Yeah. Very useful.
from all over the world. Yeah.
Very early days, so yes, you are here as a Falklands Conservation member. And yes, and we'll be speaking with, we'll look forward to speaking with government about these. As you say, it is part of a toolbox of ideas. There are lots of different ideas in there, and Grant went through a number of those, but they are big and difficult topics, very big and difficult. So really appreciate that. Was there anything else pressing, or shall we, looking at the time, help yourselves to drinks and food? But just once again to say thank you very much. Thanks for talking. Thanks everyone for your support and for the encouragement for Falklands Nature and for Falklands Conservation. Great to see you all. Please help yourself to drinks and snacks, and all very good. Thanks everybody.